deacons. This is the Homebrewed Christianity podcast, where we bring you the most zesty, tasty theological ingredients for you to brew your own faith. We don't want to think for you. No, we're not your theological mama. We're not that little daddy in the sky judging what's going through your mind. No. We don't want to think for you. We want to think with you. And today, you get to hear my conversation with Dr. Andrew Root of Luther Theological Seminary in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He's back on the podcast, and we are talking about two of his most recent books, one on practical theology, namely Christopraxis, and the other on Dietrich Bonhoeffer, when Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a youth minister. I bet you didn't know he was one, but he was, and he was one for a while. And we talk about what it was like when Dietrich Bonhoeffer was a youth worker, because Andy wrote two different books recently. One, Bonhoeffer as a youth worker, surprise, surprise, and Christopraxis, a practical theology of the cross. Anyway, I'm very glad that Andy has joined the podcast, but before we join in that conversation today, and by that I mean I will listen again to the conversation I had with him post-editing and realize that when you delete Trip sounding weird talking to someone, we sound almost like we're intelligent having a conversation. But nonetheless, that is what happens behind the curtain. You don't need to know that. But for now, I just want to tell you that if you are a member, like ordained and such, of the Disciples of Christ, and are going to the General Assembly in Columbus, Ohio, then you need to come to the Homebrewed Christianity live podcast there, July 20th in Columbus, Ohio, because I'm going to be there. Christian and Amy Pyatt are going to be there from the Culture Cast, and we're going to be joined by our friends, Trey and Carter, who are of Everyday Sunday, the band, but now Populist, where their new EP is about to come out. I've listened to it. It's everything you want in power pop, exciting, like, things. So if you just want to nod your head, you should check the EP out, but mostly you should come see them do it live July 20th on the podcast. But if you're saying to yourself, are you and Christian and Amy just going to talk to yourselves and play some music? No. Sharon Watkins, General Minister and President of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, is going to be there. Rick Lowry is going to be there. And then, oh wait, it's a surprise. I can't tell you. But Phillips Theological Seminary is sponsoring this event. It's going to be at Park Street Tavern. And that night, in the middle of the DOC General Assembly, then Homebrewed Christianity is going to bring a live theological ruckus. You'll get a free pint glass, 2 beverages, and the podcast, all for $15. You got to get your ticket in advance. Currently, I think there are 18 tickets left. So, sorry. There are 100 tickets, 18 are left. But now you know. Knowing's half the battle. That's what I've heard from G.I. Joe. So you can go do that. You know, one of the benefits of doing intros by myself is that no one's here to tell me this is a bad idea. If you ever just go on YouTube and type in, like, the moral lessons of G.I. Joe. At the end of all the G.I. Joe episodes, you know, like, they had some violence, and the myth of redemptive violence is displayed in a very, very nationalistic tone, and the other is identified as a reptile, namely that thing that tempted Adam and Eve in the garden, you know, Cobra, the bad guy. And Cobra Commander and all his reptilian friends are crushed violently, though for kids' sake, the cartoon lasers never pierce the skin in front of them. Well, except for the movie, but it was Duke, not anyone in Cobra. La, 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 la. That was their song in the movie. Anyway, it gets hit. So, like, Duke gets hit then. Anyway, but nonetheless, G.I. Joe, just Google, because after that little myth of redemptive nationalistic violence of 22 minutes, there's like a minute where they do a little moral lesson where knowing's half the battle, and there's G.I. Joe, and part of knowing is half the battle is like, don't touch live electric wires. Like, if you see a down electric pole and there's an electric wire just moving around, zip-zapping and stuff, like, if you'd watch G.I. Joe, you'd know not to stick it in your mouth. And now you all know, because you've listened to Homebrewed Christianity podcast, where knowing is half the battle. G.I. Joe. Anyway, it is kind of funny. The bad guys are the Reptilian Army, Cobra Commander, la la la. Anyway, live podcast, July 20th in Columbus, Ohio. Check out Andy Root's books, which we're about to talk about. But if you're going to get them, go to the Homebrewed Christianity webpage, which would be homebrewedchristianity.com. Click through any of our links, because if you buy them on Amazon through one of our links, we get a kickback. And the other thing is, know that this summer, you could be saying to yourself, I'm bored, Trip. I am just sitting here, and there's not a Game of Thrones episode for me to watch. I already went through the new season of Orange is the New Black. I've been looking around for new John Cobb texts to come out, and not one has come out, and Caputo has not put a new book out. It doesn't come out until October with Fortress Press on the Theology of the People line. A month before yours truly's book on Jesus comes out. Anyway, you're saying, what am I going to do this summer? Well, every Thursday of July, you can be on the interwebs with me discussing a chapter or an article that represents a different variety of postmodern theology. You can do that. All you got to do is join the Varieties of Postmodern Theology class, which is available at homebrewedchristianity.com. Alas, before we go into the interview, I just want you to know I really appreciate each one of you for listening. Hello, Homebrewed Christianity listeners. This is Tripp, and I am talking to Andy Root. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, man. It's great to be with you.
I'm excited because last time we attempted to talk about your book and got sidetracked on Eberhard Jungel.
Yeah,
and it may happen again today. I'm not going to stop from going there, but at least it's in the book itself.
That's right. This time it is in the book.
So your new book, which you are kind of a publishing machine. I'm surprised that we're able to talk, given how many books you have coming out on a regular basis. But we're going to talk about Christopraxis, a practical theology of the cross. So this book, it seems like it is a product of a whole lot of your work in your own field in practical theology. When would you say that the thesis and argument of this book showed up inside your imagination?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, I think it's been there all along, and this is probably, my most kind of monograph-like book, where it's a methodological book on practical theology, but it's definitely born within my own experience and my own experience as a young scholar, but then really my experience in the field itself and trying to figure out kind of my place within it, and really in many ways embracing practical theology as this incredible field that can really get our feet on the ground and help us talk about the church and life in our larger cultural reality, but then also having some questions to ask back towards the field. And so I guess the book is both appreciative of the field, but also has some questions to push back towards.
Yeah. And now you're a professor at Luther Seminary in St. Paul. So what does a practical theologian actually teach? Do you teach theology classes, or do you teach how to use web design to witness to people? I don't know.
Yeah, that's the big question about practical theology in general. I mean, it's is it just I teach a lot of youth ministry classes, and I remember a colleague saying to me, this is really great, and we're really happy that you're going to be doing this academic stuff and maybe even taking PhD students in practical theology and youth ministry, but we do need to know, who's going to teach the mixer, or who's going to teach the seminar on mixers, so there is this kind of sense of practical theology that it's, teaching web design or something like that. But I guess in the larger framework, practical theology does tend to kind of those fields that are directed towards the practice of ministry, homiletics, pastoral care. I like to include youth ministry in that. There's been a lot of blurring kind of over the lines as missional conversations and missiology has kind of led into practice within congregations, and the missional church conversations happen. There's been some kind of blurring of those boundaries, but for the most part, it's kind of directed towards those practices. So I think it's deeply theological. Others think it's kind of very performative, teaching people to preach or teaching people to do pastoral care. But I think it's deeply theological, and I think part of the issue with the field itself is trying to discover what makes practical theology actually theological, and I think that's been a big question.
Well, is it a bigger or smaller question than what makes theology practical?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I mean, a lot of, when you look at the history of practical theology, at least as I see it, there was a real renaissance in the 1970s. I mean, practical theology, good old Schleiermacher talked about practical theology. Yeah, being the crown of the tree, of the theological tree, so you had your historical theology and, you had, history and Bible and things like that. And then you had practical theology, which Schleiermacher was the crown of the tree. And really that was, in my estimation, it was really because Schleiermacher had to make a case for theology in a university. Mm-hmm. And as kind of secularization started to set in, to Germany and Europe at this time, practical theology became a way, to justify theology departments in universities. In other words, society needs well-trained clergy. And so we have to keep theology in the university system. So while Schleiermacher kind of set the terms for that, he also never really followed his project through. And it wasn't until the 1970s that some people like James Fowler and Don Browning and some of these other people started to kind of really reimagine practical theology and try to make an argument that all theology is practical and that practical theology can help theology reclaim its practical orientation, I guess.
Mm-hmm. So when I think of Schleiermacher and even the way he talks about the ministerial acts, which for him are connected to practical theology, I know some people debate or argue about whether or not like preaching and that kind of stuff is in practical theology or if that's something different. But I wonder how much of it for him is tied to the fact that the experience of Christ in the Christian community happens when we serve these functions, namely as the one that elicits the heartfelt response from the people in a sermon while exegeting the word and interpreting it for your congregation, or when we serve communion and you take it up symbolically as participating in the body of Christ. Like for him, there were like if you just think through the Christian faith, like how one comes to relate to God through Christ or through the very places that you would kind of, at least in Schleiermacher's definition, call practical theology.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. I mean, that kind of romanticism of Schleiermacher, I think, gives him this attention to lived and concrete realities that he really wants to attend to and seek for God within those. And so I do think that sets the terms for practical theology. I mean, I think the pushback against, practical theology has this kind of Greek mythology to it where like everyone affirms Schleiermacher, but also hates Schleiermacher, especially kind of late 20th century.
Does everyone read it?
Well, that's a good question. Everyone reads the brief outline to, whatever that is, the brief outline to theological study.
But they probably don't read the dialectic. That's when you know you're in love with Schleiermacher.
Right. I don't think they read that. I think that's really quite true. And so, the pushback against Schleiermacher had always been that he kind of gives practical theology this honored place, but then for him, theology really is imagined as theory to practice. It's not really a kind of praxis or practice to theory to practice. And so that was really the real renaissance in the 1970s, was kind of picking up some kind of more practical philosophy, picking up some other perspectives in the social sciences, was really talk about how all theology could become practical because it worked from a practice to theory to practice loop as opposed to kind of theory to practice.
Yeah. Do you, as a professor, do you notice, is there a difference between students? Right? Like, because whenever I read practical theology, and like in your book, you talk about like the context is the like concrete lived experience of human beings in communities with God as mediated by Jesus. Like, I like that conceptually. Because I like process philosophy. So I'm wondering, like, is this a personality thing? Because, like, Bo, who does practical theology, he and I will argue incessantly about these kind of things. And I'm wondering, like, is someone kind of naturally inclined towards beginning with kind of the theory and moving to practice, or beginning at what is actually happening and then, thinking out of it and back down?
Yeah, that's a great question. I would personally think that there's something to do with personality in that, and I see that with my students. I guess a big question is, and this is maybe a pushback to the field, is good theory, is it devoid of the practical in many ways? I think there is a sense that good theory actually is embedded in our practical experience, and I think practical theology has probably been too quick to rule out a start with theory as a problem. Mm-hmm. But I do think people who kind of fall into practical theology or move themselves into practical theology have a certain kind of personality disposition towards lived experience. Maybe this is a complete generalization, but they may be kind of more artistic in disposition or something like that than maybe systematic, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, it makes sense. I just I've had an experience talking to people in practical theology, and I always wonder if they were better at understanding every other theory than just systematic theology, right? Like if you're sitting there having a conversation with someone that does theology, and the only thing that they say about theology is kind of some like straw man problem that then is critiqued by this really artfully constructed connection between social scientific research, 3 congregations in the same zip code with a beginning with a different median average income in homes of at least 4th generation Swedish Lutherans, right? Like you have this like intense understanding application on the ground thing, and then when it got to the theology, it was like, well, that's Luther's 2 doctrines theory, and anyway. So I'm interested in your book because I see like both being pushed aggressively. So how do you imagine practical theology, or how would you want to talk about it when you take both the kind of social scientific investigation of lived experience, but also kind of a very thick or rich account of theology?
Yeah, I think this is actually the real challenge for the field. One of my heroes in the field that was kind of always sidelined, I think, within the field was this guy named James Loader, who taught at Princeton for many years. And this really significant article, Loader says that the generative problematic of practical theology is divine and human action. In other words, it's a problematic, like how do you relate divine action and human action, but it's also quite generative. And if I had to kind of have a snarky pushback to the field of practical theology, it's that we've kind of given away the generative problematic, that we've done incredible projects around human action, like what is human action, and turned to the social sciences and gotten really great conversations with university-based disciplines to talk about the significance of human action, whether it's been empirical, whether it's been psychological, whatever. But I think that intensity and that real theory construction has happened to the detriment of the theological. So what I'm really trying to do in this book is like, how do we talk about divine action and human action actually coming together? And so that's really what I'm interested in the project, is trying to think about how can divine action be something that we give shape to how people experience within the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I don't think practical theology is the only discipline that has this issue, right? Like, if you, a very popular conversation I've had while at Claremont and at Wake Forest Div School is talking to students in their first year who come up like freaking out right after their first year of Hebrew Bible, and they could have gotten A's, become masterful exegesis, know their Wellhausen, and but that whole history that's told in the text is not told in a theological way at all, right? Like the entire story of Israel, the texts that are there, what's behind the text, it's exegesis, is looking at it historically, and all these types of things. The way the Enlightenment mind teaches us to encounter human beings, their communities, their histories, the texts they produce, is as if there's a world without God in it, participating and acting. And so I think that question of divine action, goes all the way to how we understand biblical studies, how we tell church history. Like you would be surprised that the church was born at Pentecost, because when I read accounts in church history books of the Reformation, the printing press is more important than the Holy Spirit. So,
yeah, right.
Like, where do you kind of see that issue kind of taking root in theological education?
Yeah, no, I think that's actually huge. And, I'm, it doesn't come up in this book, but have read and been inspired a lot by Charles Taylor's work, The Secular Age. And I think this is part of our challenge, living in what Taylor would call the immanent frame, which is how do you talk about God who actually acts, moves, and does something when we kind of presume culturally that that's implausible or that seems weird, or we just don't have the constructs to name that. And I think what practical theology has done is basically follow the immanent frame and basically uphold that, and basically say, well, we're gonna think of our field outside of God actually moving in a living kind of encountered way. And I guess that's what you're saying has happened in all theological fields, and I think that's really true. I think it's just the tension of living in the immanent frame. But to me, it makes it all the more important then that we find ways of really thinking about how we then present divine action as plausible or as a possibility.
Yeah, and I think part of it is what's considered plausible is based on the normative vision of truth in a society, and that's more determined by social and psychological factors than whether or not it has some veracity to it. So when no one had to explain to Schleiermacher and friends about Christianity and God, right? Like when he walked out of the University of Berlin's door, he was more likely going to run into someone who just talked to Jesus than someone who thought he may not have existed. And part of it is the way these academic disciplines are experienced existentially by disciples when the university is no longer in kind of the Christian village, if that makes sense. Like post-Christendom, the university then becomes the place that the church originally kind of created for critical thinking, in a sense, now becomes a place that insists it stays away.
Right.
And
right. Exactly.
So I wonder how. As a practical theologian, where is how does one begin to talk about God, like a God who does things, with the kind of the tools of studying specific experiences and communities and encounters with the divine?
Yeah, where I try to do it within this book, or what I'm trying to push for, is to hold up, and I think this is central to the field itself, is to hold up the lived, concrete experience as central. And again, maybe this goes back to your kind of personality types, but I think those of us who maybe are haunted by our lived experience or came into Christianity or Christian faith through our lived experience, and others who kind of thought their way into the Christian faith, maybe if you just kind of had, again, this is just completely off the top of my head, but maybe if you kind of had this deep experience, practical theology really resonates with you. So I wanted to actually explore that. And in my own experience is one where I felt like Jesus really came to me. Like it was a real experience. It's doubted, and I still struggle with, was that true, or was that psychological transference? What was that? But nevertheless, it was substantive, and it was a real experience. So I want to actually start with people's real experiences. One of the things I want to push back against the field is that I actually think people have real experiences of transcendence or real experiences of God. They don't always know how to make sense of those, but that they have these experiences. And I think practical theology has tended to rule out divine action as a plausible thing to talk about because they figure it's impractical. And it's impractical because they presume off the bat that God doesn't really exist or move, or God's frozen in some theological tradition that you can go to and draw from, but that actually God as an agent who encounters you, or maybe this is a place to talk about Jungel. The fact that God's being may be in becoming, that God may actually encounter you, they don't believe, so therefore we don't really need to talk about divine action. So I tried to start with my own experience of God coming to me, and then I did interview 10 people, kind of in a Tanya Luhrmann kind of way in her book, When God Talks Back, where she studied these vineyard churches, and these people often talked about Jesus coming to them. And I went to mainline churches, 2 Presbyterian churches and a Lutheran church, and tried to ask that same question. Like, if you ever had an experience where you felt like it was of God, and, I only interviewed 10 people and did this thing called life history interviewing, where you're just kind of asking them to tell their story. But all of these 10 people had experiences where they felt like Jesus came to them, like they encountered the living Christ. And what I try to explore in the book is that the way this Jesus came to them really was as kind of this weak force of ministry that came to minister to them, to encounter them in their experience of death or of suffering and bring forth new life to them. So I'm trying to kind of push that into the view of practical theology to say if lived concrete experience really matters, then what about people's lived concrete experience of transcendence or of divine action in some way? And we have to attend to that. And it actually is practical. I mean, it rearranges people's lives. Like Jesus comes to them, and we might think they're crazy, but they hear Jesus come to them after their wife of 50 years has died, and it reorders their life. Like they said, I hear Jesus say to me, Maureen is fine, get up and live, and my depression went away. Like there's something really profound about that. And so I wanted to honor those experiences, and I thought that becomes a doorway into talking about what divine action actually looks like.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things that I've been thinking about is how this predicament that shows up in theological education is in many ways connected to society at large having lost the desire to even understand the claims about God that they're denying. So when you don't understand them, I mean, you're not really denying them. You're just deciding they're uninteresting or you're uninvested in hearing or learning about them to actually engage with them. And the frustrating thing that I've encountering with students is something like you're talking about, that they come to seminaries or wanting to be ministers because of those type of experiences, right? Divine encounters. No one usually says, I have a pretty good IQ, learning potential, I have social skills, I can read and write. And you know what? I'm going to go to a master's degree that's not 45 hours, not 60, but 90 hours of work so that I can get out with school debt, so I can serve communion to people and talk for 20 minutes each week, right? Like there is a real story behind anyone that would decide to go through the process of theological education and ordination and serving communities. And then the inherited kind of philosophical assumptions in so many of the disciplines are ones where the question of divine activity is one that's not even permitted on the table.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, like in theological education, I mean, and I think my school tends not to fall completely into this ugly ditch, but it's just amazing how the current of theological education, and I think this is embedded in the cultural reality you're talking about, really tries to beat out of people their experience of divine action. And that becomes a real problem because, like you're saying, there's really no cultural esteem in being a pastor right now, and you're not going to make any more money. And people stumble into these institutions, I think, in many ways because they have had this experience, and then they spend 3 years and 90 hours and thousands of dollars of debt having that experience beat out of them in one way or deconstructed.
And this is one of the things that just drives me nuts about theological education. But what I don't get is how it's hard for people to posit the possibility that you can give an explanatory account of a phenomena from multiple different angles, right? Like you could give a psychological account of an experience of transcendence. You could go through multiple phenomenological reductions and give an account of the givenness of said experience. You could look at their family history and the roles they play and give like a family systems account of what their anxiety point would be and what release would look like. You could do all these different ways. And for some reason, like, you can line those up, but the moment a divine relationship to any of it comes up, no, we've explained away the experience, so that's not possible. And until people get the level of fidelity that they're inheriting via kind of scientific reductionistic determinism and this kind of thing, like so many people that are theologians and people in disciplines, I think they're unaware of their brazen allegiance to this kind of reductive account of religious and spiritual phenomena.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, without trying to be, again, snarky, I mean, I think practical theology, because of its inherent connection to the interdisciplinary nature of it, because of its connection to the social sciences particularly, that it's been, he's really guilty of falling into that trap. So it doesn't make me popular.
No, yeah. but one of the things I think you point out in the book, though, is that it's also extremely poised to force back to everyone else to take seriously what we're all ignoring in the other disciplines.
Yeah,
Practical
exactly.
theology doesn't go in and go, well, Tripp, you do know that in Adventures of the Spirit, Whitehead reorganized his understanding of mutual indwelling after he recognized the brilliance that was the Cappadocians' notion of mutual indwelling in the Trinitarian controversies. And if you just, that's not how you do it. Like, you're sitting there interviewing people, you're like, I just wanted to let you know, like, if you're interested in concrete lived cases of human beings' experience, like, they did not have a feeling of their finitude threatening them. They had an experience of Jesus. So,
Right.
what do you want to do with that?
That's exactly right. So while practical theology has kind of followed that trail into the social sciences and maybe reduced reality too often, practical theology, I mean, again, this is why I'm committed to the field, also stands in an incredible place to actually offer something theological to the field that really honors people's lived concrete experience, their experience of Jesus. Yeah.
So when I was talking, I got stuck in a meal with a bunch of practical theologians, and as doing philosophy of religion, it just drives you nuts when you're there, and so I remember them saying, well, like they're arguing, do you when you're doing practical theology, do you want to write and investigate it where all the people that read it would go, yep, they rightfully reported, and all your assessments, which I assume have something to do with theology, are just left off on the table. Like, you're not doing theology with your practical theology. And then the others, you have like the way you relate theory and religion, and then you take it into these concrete things that so that you're paying attention in these religious experiences, community, and things to what theologians tell you not to pay attention to. And they were debating these back and forth, and I was like, have you thought about God? Like, I mean, and I said because I went arguing with them, just saying like, you can, philosophy of religion and theology, we do these things, we connect these different disciplines, blah, 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 but we can still talk about God sometimes. And then in part 2 of your book, you pulled the rug out from underneath me because you don't talk about God, you talk about Christ. And so what I found interesting in your book is I thought, like if I hadn't read the table of contents, that you're setting up for kind of a robust understanding of the God-world relationship. And then in Christians, it's thematized in these kind of cruciform experiences. But the way you understand the God-world relationship and divine action is thoroughly Christocentric. So could you kind of tell me how you got to making it Christocentric and what about those accounts made you choose to focus on Christ as opposed to maybe a pneumatological account, right? Like you can do Holy Spirit and you can Moltmann that junk up, or you do like a kind of a philosophy of God. Like, why something so tradition and specific?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So, I mean, I think probably, again, this is a very practical theology thing to do, but to say it's pretty biographical. And for me, the other book we may get to, we may not, is the Bonhoeffer book. And so Bonhoeffer is a central dialogue partner for me. And so there's something about the way Bonhoeffer thinks and maybe just this kind of Lutheran Reformed kind of Barthian tradition that I'm in thinks Christocentrically that leads me down there. And so I would say that, yeah, that's probably true, but I'd also say there's something about my lived experience that points me to Christology too. Like the 2 books that we've talked about on this podcast, or the other one is the Promise of Despair. And both these books, ironically, start with the same story of my friend when I'm 4 years old dying of cancer. Mm-hmm. And, one of the big situations that happens in that story is that I really do have this experience of Jesus coming to me. I mean, it was Jesus. Now, again, we could deconstruct that and say, well, that's...
What did Jesus look like?
Yeah.
Well, I had a dream where I swore it was me, Jesus, Reinhold Niebuhr, and having a serious conversation, and Jesus looked like Bob Marley.
Really?
Yeah.
Yeah, no, my Jesus didn't look like Bob Marley.
He was not a big fan of moral man and immoral society.
That's funny. That's very funny. I don't know how to follow that trip, actually. That's just a great line.
At some point, I'm sure I'll be able to use it for something positive. But like, I rarely have very vivid dreams. And when I do, I often have I'll have ones where like people I read too much of, and I have conversations.
Yeah.
But I was like, oh, Bob Marley's here. And then I realized it was Jesus.
It's not Bob Marley. It's Jesus. Yeah, that's funny. It's like the road to Emmaus through Jamaica or something like that, man.
Oh, there you go. That's the article title.
That's the article.
Emmaus to Jamaica.
Right. So there was this sense of, for me, like experiencing Jesus come to me. But the way that I try to kind of work that out in this book, and maybe why I don't want to call it I want to call it Christocentric for sure. I don't know that it's Christological. It is, but I actually want to do this thing called Christopraxis and talk about the very being of God comes to us, as I'm imagining it here, in the person of Jesus Christ. And I'm trying to do that because, again, I'm following Jungel here in this idea that God's being is in becoming, in that Jesus Christ becomes the kind of hermeneutic of God's very ministry. So I'm actually trying to make ministry this sense of sharing in the life of another, of participating in their experiences of death that leads to new possibility. That ministry actually is, to me, the ontological shape of God's own being. That, I mean, this is this deep kind of sense of kenosis here, that God chooses to kind of come and encounter the world as a minister, and the fullness of that is Jesus Christ. So to encounter God's very being in a concrete, lived way is to encounter God's ministry, is to encounter God's being that comes to us as the act of ministry, and Jesus is the full representation of that. And this is, I guess, to follow Jungel, that Jesus is the hermeneutic of God's being as becoming, that Jesus is the hermeneutic of God's ministry. So I want it to be fully Trinitarian, and I try to make this case, but instead of calling it pneumatological praxis or, Trinitarian praxis or something, called Christopraxis, because I think it connects to that lived concrete experience. And I think it represents something both in the encounter of revelation of Jesus Christ becoming near to us, but also this Trinitarian reality of Jesus being the full representation of God's ministry. So I think that's kind of the contribution I'm trying to make, actually. I mean, it seems obscurely theological, but the sense that God's being comes to us as a force of ministry, as a weak cruciform force of ministry, and that's fully represented in the person of Jesus Christ.
I mean, I don't know why it would be totally shocking that a practical Christian theologian would think that to do practical theology has something to do with the presence of the living Christ and community. It tends to be how many people are going to get up on Sunday morning and miss good football games for no reason?
Right.
Just saying, I can join my activist groups and sleep in. So what? Maybe you could talk about how, as someone who's engaging in theology and then turning to the people's kind of long stories you encountered. How did the connection start to get made, and you piece together your kind of larger vision of what Christopraxis is?
Yeah, I mean, so a really formative story was this story this woman told me named Rachel, who talked about, it was a 20-minute conversation, and the whole time she was bored or annoyed with me. You just kind of had this sense like she didn't need to be talking to this Yahoo practical theologian that her pastor told her to talk to, but here we were talking. So we're talking, and I'm kind of thinking this is like how the sausage is made academically. You're thinking I'm going to have to delete this file. This is just not going to work for my research. And then at the very, I had one more question to ask her. And I said, so Rachel, have you ever had an experience where you felt ministered to? You felt like the presence of God was there because you were ministered to? And she said, oh yeah, I have. She said, I never told anyone this story, but, yeah, totally. I felt this. And she said, I've been telling you throughout this interview that I'm a single mom, but I never told you why I'm a single mom. She said, the reason I'm a single mom is because about 4 years ago, I had an infant and a toddler, and my husband went on a business trip to Chicago, flew from Seattle to Chicago, and he had a heart attack in his hotel room and died. And I got a phone call that said, you need to fly to Chicago, identify your husband's body, and make arrangements to take it back to Seattle. She said she took off, she flew, and she said she doesn't even remember the flight. She was just drowning in grief. She got there, and she had made arrangements that she wasn't going to spend the night in Chicago. She was going to identify the body and be on the next flight back. She had a card to the hospital where the morgue was, where her husband's body was located. So she gave the cabbie the card, and he drove her to the hospital. And she said, I should have noticed this, that he didn't stop up front, but he parked. But I was drowning in grief, so I just walked in. And she said they were waiting for me. And as soon as I got there, they took me immediately back. and they took me over to where the stretcher where my husband's body was. They pulled back the sheet, and they showed me his body to identify it. And just as they did that, I felt a hand on my shoulder and a water bottle come around, and she said, it was the cabbie. And she said, I never felt more ministered to or assured that, and this is what she said, that the presence of Jesus was with me when this cabbie ministered to me. So I'm trying to kind of articulate in the book like this foolishness of the gospel, this foolishness of divine action itself, which comes to us more in this reality of a cabbie who shares in our experiences of death or of impossibility, and try to articulate how those experiences become incredibly transformational to people. And it could be that the reason she says it's Jesus is because she's been given this cultural narrative, and this is just the culture she's grown up in. Or it could be that I should really honor her as a true practical theologian that has to listen to her story, that I should honor her articulation of her story, and that maybe she did have an experience of Jesus being there. So I presume those stories to be true enough for me to try to give the theological shape of what those lived concrete experiences might be. So again, I mean, there's this sense where people have this experience of God, and they say it's an experience of ministry, that God comes and ministers to them, or God comes and calls them into ministry. I had other people in my interviews who said things like, oh yeah, I know God, I'm not someone who believes that, Jesus talks to you or anything, but one time in my life, Jesus talked to me, and my friend had just lost his father, and I heard Jesus say to me, plain as day, when I was gardening, like, go tell your friend, whatever his name was, this word. And he said, it was this kind of call. He didn't use this word language, but I'm interpreting it as like this call into ministry. So I'm trying to develop this dynamic sense of ministry as a theological reality, as also this kind of lived experience of people.
Mm-hmm. So how do you see the relationship between the experience and the tradition itself? Like, I think of, what's the story in the Hebrew Bible? Like, the call of Samuel, right? Like, he's hearing, Samuel, and Samuel assumes, I got my mentors over here. He's old. He's probably hollering and needs help getting to the bathroom or whatnot. But over time, right, he's taught that call is the God of Israel.
Right.
And, then, so like, you kind of have both plays, right? Like, the tradition in one sense gives us the ears to be able to hear and receive the experiences as experiences of the presence of Christ, but also the experiences are what sustains and preserves the tradition community in that sense over time.
Yeah, totally. And I think this is probably potentially one of the dangerous elements of my book, at least within the field, is that there's a certain aversion in practical theology towards kind of running to doctrinal theology or systematic or philosophical theology and just trying to apply that. Like there needs to be something that practical theology creates on its own. So I mean, I think this is a misread of my book, but part of the misread could be, well, here you are. I mean, all you're doing really is wrapping doctrinal theology in the wrapping paper of practical theology, but really all you're doing is making a case for things like justification and in its own way participation as sanctification. Like that's all this is. And I actually want to push back at that. I mean, at one point, in I think chapter 4 of the book, I do say there's a certain practical theologian that I think overuses doctrine to the point where human experience has no place in his thought because it's just like doctrine. All it is just doctrine. And so I don't want to go to that extreme, but I also do want to uphold doctrine or the tradition as the trusted articulations of people's experience with divine action, of people's experience with Christopraxis. So does that always have to be put in a kind of a hermeneutic, a critique and conversation and reinterpretation? Of course, but we also should honor it as people's lived experience, trying to make sense of their lived experience of God's presence. And it's one of the reasons why I turn to justification. I mean, one of the reasons I turn to justification in the book is because, as you'll agree, Jungel is just awesome, and he goes to justification. But the other element of it is, at least in North American practical theology, I mean, it seems quite ironic to me that no practical theologian that I can think of has really drawn from justification as a way of imagining practical theology, which seems fairly important because, at least within the traditions that I live in, like justification is a fairly central doctrine of the Protestant Reformation. And so I tried to, and I think that's one of the reasons, like, certain Lutheran communities have always looked sideways at practical theology, because it seems to kind of move somewhere else than justification and soteriology, and can easily open up to this kind of Aristotelian perspective that human action can actually get to some telos that's a good, where Luther was pretty sure that human action had no possibility of doing anything of productive value, really, until it was transformed by the Spirit. So I actually want to see, and this is an odd bedfellow here with Jungel, but want to see justification as a very practical doctrine that interprets our human experience and interprets our experience with divine action as well.
Yeah, and one of the things I don't read lots of practical theology to know that Christian theologians and Protestants avoid justification, but it seems to me that justification would be kind of central, because especially Jungel's notion, he has a very thick description of justification, and at some point we should just do a Jungel podcast.
You should, yeah.
But one of the things he points out is that the experience of the Christian and the Christian community and the way they relate to the world is the world as it's given back to them after God has come to them. Mm-hmm. And it's a hermeneutical account, but it's also a very specific one in the sense that the materiality of that which is their community, themselves, and their world is received differently after the event of justification. And the stories of the people that you interviewed in the things are people who, when you ask questions long enough and you ask them why it is they see the world this way and what are the experience of things, they are experiences that happened that then gave them a new lens to reread their own story, their sufferings, their joys, and all these types of things. It gave them a new way of relating to their hopes and fears in the future. It gave them a way of relating to the things they carry. There's stories of people that had guilt or shame and that kind of stuff. I don't know why. To me, it's the most obvious doctrine to deal with that in, right? Justification is what we talk about when we talk about that as Christians.
Right, and I think the problem has been in practical theology that really the renaissance of practical theology was in many ways contingent on kind of a recovery of Aristotle. And this sense of praxis obviously comes from Aristotle, and certain liberation theologies, kind of more Marxist take of praxis and things like that, but also particularly Don Browning works a lot with this sense of phronesis, and phronesis being this kind of practical wisdom, and so that we can honor and look at concrete communities because they have their own kind of practical wisdom. So there's been this kind of strong sense in the performative nature of practical theology. If we can help people preach towards excellence, it actually can lead to the telos of good preaching. There's this sense where Aristotle has been very, very significant. And one of the reasons that I actually decided to do this project is because I think it's in Jungel's Theological Essays 1, or maybe it's in Theological Essays 2, but he has this chapter on justification in Aristotle, and he just kind of a la Luther, but in this more kind of philosophical, theological way, just takes apart this very kind of central piece that practical theology, at least in North America since the 1970s, has been really built on. And that he really, I think, shows in a very convincing way that too often Aristotelian perspectives in Aristotle is built on this from possibility to actuality. That if you want to be a good guitar player, you can just continue to work on that, and you can actually create the actuality of you being a good guitar player. But Luther's perspective, of course, maybe that works on the guitar, but when it works on kind of soteriology, it doesn't work that way. There's utter human impossibility, and you need only the act of God who can come and justify you.
Yeah.
So Jungel has this place where God moves is not in possibilities to actualities, but where God moves is between impossibility and new possibility. Where God moves is between nothingness and new possibility. And so justification actually is this incredible act of grace that restores to us, in Jungel's sense, this reality of impossibility or of ex nihilo. So for him, it's this connection between creation ex nihilo and justification. That justification is the reinstating of the ex nihilo, which the way I interpret this is that ex nihilo is necessary because we need another to be our minister. We need God to be our minister, and God ministers to us out of this ex nihilo. So justification becomes central because it reminds us again that we need a minister in our neighbor, that I need my neighbor to minister to me, but also that represents and actually mediates the presence of God who comes to us as minister. So justification becomes this really lived, concrete doctrine, or this kind of proto-hermeneutical doctrinal perspective that helps us interpret our existence, but also helps us interpret divine action that comes to us in this experience of nothingness, which again connected to my interviews. Like people, when I said, when have you experienced God? They always would tell me a story of impossibility or nothingness, that God came to them and came to them as this reality of ministering to them or sending them into the nothingness of someone else to minister to them. So it's kind of existential in that way, but I think it does give us a way of imagining divine action, which I guess goes back to your question earlier, why there's this kind of Christocentrism in it, is because to me the cross becomes this way of imagining the encounter of divine and human action. Like the place where God concretely encounters us is in this paradigm of from impossibility to new possibility.
Yeah. No, that I like that Jungel article. And
yeah, it's great. Yeah.
And one of the other things that it's connected to is that's how Jungel kind of develops his notion of the ontological priority of the future is that way. And which again, it should not be shocking, I think, that Christians would give account of religious experience that gives priority to Jesus not just being the first fruits. But how much of it do you think is Kant? Like, I mean, do you like where the philosophy behind so many kind of social sciences is Kantian, then you're kind of cut off from the very beginning for something being practical that's doesn't really fit in some sense, and either this Aristotelian form or in a kind of critical theory way. Like,
yeah, I think it, without being over dramatic or overstating it, I think it has a ton to do with Kant, and still some of these constructs we're stuck within. And I think we just kind of presume, and this becomes the illusion that practical theology is actually attentive to the practical, is that we already presume that there are only phenomenal realities, and anything noumenal is not real. So you can't, talk about that, or if it's real, it's so behind some kind of wall that you can't get to it. So practical theology is the best kind of theology, again, to use Taylor's language, in the immanent frame, because it already presumes that any noumenal reality is not a possibility. And so, yeah, I mean, a new project that I'm trying to work on is to actually draw from the Finnish interpretation of Luther that tries to make an argument that Luther had been totally interpreted through neo-Kantian kind of perspectives, and that, I think they're trying to make Luther ecumenical enough to be in dialogue with Russian Orthodoxy and things like that. And so, they have their axe to grind, but another way, it's really quite interesting to think about as a constructive theological move.
Yeah. Have you read Kathryn Tanner's Christ the Key?
Yeah, for sure. Yep.
Yeah, because she kind of takes that reading of Luther and then hooks it with her reading of the Cappadocians. There's like weak participation and strong participation, right. and strong participation in the divine life, which God always intended to give, comes through the event of grace. And you become aware that this is what's going on. How does that actually impact you as a Christian, as a minister, and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I mean, what I'm trying to work out then is that if we do encounter God as the being that's becoming as ministry, then the way we actually participate, and I guess this is up for debate. Like, I think one of the interesting things about practical theology is that we haven't really wanted to talk much in any kind of ontological categories. So there hasn't been really wanting to talk about anything ontological. There's been a lot of kind of epistemology about religious experience, but none of this kind of sense of participation in the being of God. And so I'm trying to actually explore if we encounter the being of God as this reality of ministry, then we actually share in the very form of God by a fellowship of action, which is to be ministers ourselves. So then we're actually called to be ministers. So what I'm really trying to argue is that all of practical theology, really, if it wants to be theological and yet attend to human action, has to be about ministry. That ministry has to be the priority, because ministry can be a divine reality as well as a concrete human reality with even performative elements to it. But once we turn practical theology into reflection on practice or of the arts of ministry or something like that, we actually move far afield from divine action as the theological. So I want to make an argument that practical theology actually is ministry, which leads us to have to attend to what is the shape of God's ministry of divine action, and then how do we participate in that as an ontological reality? Like, how do we participate in the very being of God, but then how do we live that out? And this is probably where I'm very inspired by Bonhoeffer, that there is this sense that we share and are conformed to the person of Christ by actually, Bonhoeffer wouldn't quite use these words. Well, Bonhoeffer would use the words through Stellvertretung, by being a place sharer to our neighbor, by sharing their place, by embracing them. And I want to actually think of that as actually ministry, of like ministering to their humanity, that becomes the place where we actually share in the very being of God as a spiritual reality, as a participatory reality.
How does this impact our understanding of mission?
Yeah, I mean, so for me, I say this in chapter 5, I guess, that I want to have a pretty strong connection between mission and ministry. Like, I think God's mission, in kind of the sense of the Missio Dei, is God's ministry, is to give God's very self to humanity, so that God might participate in the life of humanity and in creation, and so that creation, a la Athanasius, might participate in God.
What does Christopraxis do to mission?
Yeah, I mean, for me, Christopraxis has, I think, a real connection with mission, though it does drive, and I think this is where that missional conversation is at its best, is what is the shape of divine action? Where, I think part of the issue with the missional conversation has been that it's become a lot about leadership for pastoral practice and revitalizing the institutional church, where I think at its richest, it's really about the shape of divine action. And so for me, I see a real connection, a resonance between thinking of God's being as the becoming of ministry, of the encounter of ministry and mission. I do want this sense of participation. Like, the point is that God calls us into participating in the life of God. And so sometimes I don't know if the missional conversation goes as ontological as I actually want to go, and as deeply transformational to the human person and to the human spirit, that I think sometimes would be helpful to go. I think the missional conversation tends to be about revitalizing institutions as opposed to how the human being actually encounters the living presence of Jesus Christ through the Spirit, maybe.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the things I've been thinking about is how, or maybe what places we as Christians or as theologians ask our questions. Like, what are the places? Because in the Gospels, Jesus kind of basically just says, like, I'll show up in 3 places. One's the table, then in community, and then among the oppressed. And I think there's a sense that if we miss those, like if we've tried to find answers outside of community, then we end up in a lot of personal speculation. And practical theologians kind of push back, right? Like, hey, theologians, if you've been to church in the last year, it might be helpful. Spectator theology doesn't exist. But if we're away from the table, then our answers escape our own brokenness and the abundance of grace. And I think that one of the things your book does so well is it kind of points where we ask our questions and where we talk to the place of this encounter that's centered on the places where we are real about ourselves. And as Christians, I think part of the place we're most real is where we recognize our brokenness and the abundance of grace. And then there's like, if you're distant and you're ignorant of the oppressed, then we basically, our answers to questions end up as kind of idolatrous shields to just protect our power and our privilege. And all 3 of those, I think, have a bit that practical theology done well turns us back to, if that makes sense.
I think that's beautiful. And I think it does kind of connect And this is what inspires me is, I mean, Jungel's line that we have to ask the question, where is Jesus Christ, is, I think, incredibly significant. And I think practical theology has to really wrestle with that question. And so in this book, like the Matthew 25 text, Lord, Lord, when did we see you? And, you know, when you shared in the life of your neighbor, when you shared in their homelessness, their hunger, in their moments of imprisonment, I was there. I mean, to me, that becomes a really central perspective. And I probably overuse that verse throughout the book, because it becomes so significant. And the communal reality as well. I think if there's a place where maybe the book could have gone deeper, it's around the table. I mean, there's not a lot about kind of the liturgical life or the Eucharist or anything like that within the book, and that's probably my own experiences with the presence of God have come more in these experiences of caring for others and being cared for, and in these times of community. So, but yeah, I think you're exactly right.
Yeah. Why I thought of it is because Luther's own, like his logic of the gospel, is it comes out of the sacraments, right? Like he takes that logic and then applies it to other things, and I wonder how much for especially for Lutherans, but I'm a Luther fan, is how much of that hermeneutic comes from the repetition of communion, of, like, I mean, if you just think of the liturgy, right? Like you come in and it's like, we're only talking about God currently, and it's gratitude and joy and thankfulness to be here. Now we talk about reality. It's ourselves, and we confess our sins. Now there's abundance of grace. Now we listen to the word. Now we're responding to the word. Now we're being sent out. Like the rhythm of the liturgy with the table at its center is, in a sense, it's like pedagogical for opening us up to experiencing and identifying those experiences as Christ, which I think a lot of times people miss. Yeah. Right? Like especially now that people have disengaged from the rhythm of regular church life, I find it fascinating when someone that has kind of reconnected the church and been there 5 or 6 months, coming regularly and stuff, and all of a sudden they retell their own experiences of their past completely differently.
Yeah.
And it was like in the rhythm of the church, they're able to bring some things to the surface that weren't there before, see them differently, and that kind of thing.
Yeah, and it's a lived experience, and I think that becomes, to me, essential. And when you talk to these people, that their experience of Jesus or their way they're retelling their story through the liturgy is a lived, concrete experience, and they feel like they're having some kind of real encounter with divine action.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So you should say something about Bonhoeffer as a youth minister, because or otherwise it will never happen. So,
all right.
Why would a youth worker go check out Bonhoeffer?
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good question. Why would a youth worker go check out Bonhoeffer? And I guess you could ask it the other way. Why has Bonhoeffer scholarship, that's been, how many books you think a year are published on Bonhoeffer?
A few.
Yeah, like at least a couple dozen. Well, at least a dozen. Why has no one ever really sketched out the depth of Bonhoeffer's youth work? So to answer your first question,
because Charles Marsh was on the podcast recently talking about his book, and in Strange Glory, he spends quite a bit of time talking about Bonhoeffer's student ministry and how it morphs into his ecumenical work, and it's like there in those situations that he first kind of starts connecting the political dots to the gospel. And I mean, there's a whole lot that happens in Dietrich's life that is about him being a youth minister.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I really try to sketch in this book that really from 1925, so Bonhoeffer is 19 and starting his doctoral dissertation, which just makes you feel bad about yourself. He's 19, he's starting at the University of Berlin, and he starts in youth ministry because he still kind of has this vision that maybe, he thinks he's going to be an academic, but he also has this kind of weird pull towards the pulpit. And so he starts the ordination process, and the first thing that they say as he goes to start the ordination process, they're like, hey, you know what? probably be a good thing for you to go to church for once, since you didn't grow up in the church and you didn't go to church growing up, and you may want to be a pastor. You might want to actually go to church. So they send him to like the congregation in his neighborhood, and they just say, hey, why don't you do the children's ministry? So he starts doing children's ministry. And so here he is. I mean, here's this young man, 19, like riding the train every day with Harnack. And, he's at like dinner parties with all these high intellectuals at his house with his dad as the chair of psychiatry at the University of Berlin. And he's writing this dissertation on the church and the sociological form of the church. And he's also doing children's ministry and writing children's sermons. And according to Betka, he's like just as inspired by the children's ministry as anything else. And so these dual passions. But really it's from 1925 until 1939. Like you look consistently through Bonhoeffer's life, he's doing either ministry with children or with youth throughout his whole life. And it only stops in 1939 because basically all of his ministry stops in 39. Where any ministry now has to be through circular letters and things like that. And so kind of any formal ministry ends, and then he becomes, the cool double agent spy that we all marvel over. But so all of Bonhoeffer's adult life, really from 25 to 39, he's doing youth ministry throughout the whole thing. So why should a youth worker concern themselves with Bonhoeffer? I think one of the reasons we should concern ourselves with Bonhoeffer, people who do youth ministry, is that we stand in a pretty significant legacy, at least that goes back to Bonhoeffer, of someone who was thinking theologically next to young people, or even thinking about young people in a theological way. And it's something that North American youth ministry has done a really, dare I say, piss poor job at actually thinking theologically about the practice of youth ministry. And I think we could recover Bonhoeffer as maybe a forefather that, at least at the very least, whether we get into his thought or not, inspires us to have to think deeper about what it is we're actually doing in ministry. And then I think, Bonhoeffer's scholarship really, I don't know if it's a bias towards younger populations of people, or it's a reaction against youth ministry often being so anti-intellectual or something. But it seems to me, at least in the English-speaking world, it's been a huge, huge error that we haven't seen how consistently Bonhoeffer's thought is. And, so you have Marsh, who does a great job of pulling that out. But I think everyone writes the Bonhoeffer story, and Bonhoeffer can be interpreted in so many ways. And so I'm obviously interpreting Bonhoeffer here, but I think it's a pretty captivating story that this is a youth worker doing deep theology, or a theologian with young people on his mind.
And Bonhoeffer was not very cool.
Yeah, right.
Someone may be thinking, I've read Letters and Papers. That does not sound like my Sunday nights with pizza discussions.
Yeah, right, and that's totally true. But then you read other stuff, and it's amazing the practice of ministry this guy did. When he takes over his out of control confirmation class in the wedding district of Berlin. So it's an area where kids are kind of facing poverty and facing a lot of difficult situations, and then the National Socialists are coming through and really oppressing a lot of kids who have certain kind of communist leanings, or they're taking out communist groups in the area. And Bonhoeffer is actually taken into the confirmation class because the confirmation class is completely out of control.
Yeah.
And this, I don't know how old he is, this Pastor Mueller, can't take it anymore. So he's like, I'm out of here. So he takes Bonhoeffer into the class, and as they enter the building, all the boys are up on the top railing, and they start throwing banana peels and garbage down on them and yelling and screaming. And then finally they walk up, and Pastor Mueller pushes all the kids into the room, and then he screams at the top of his lungs, "Your new teacher is Herr Professor, or Herr Dr. Bonhoeffer." And then they all start chanting, "Bon, bon, 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 bon." And Mueller just gets out of there. He's like, I'm out of here. Hell with this. I'm gone. I'm not teaching this class anymore. I'm leaving. And just shuts the door. And, he ended up thinking as he's walking down the stairs, will they murder this guy? Will they kill Bonhoeffer? And so Dietrich just stands in the front, and they're chanting, "Bon, bon, bon." And he just quietly starts telling them a story of New York City in 1930-31 when he was there at Union. And he starts telling them the story, and only the boys in the front row can hear it. And so they be quiet so they can hear it. And then it is a wave, goes to the back of the room, and they're quiet. And then he finishes the story, and Dietrich says to the boys, "If you come back next week and you're quiet, I'll tell you another story of New York City." And this becomes his pedagogy, is that he holds his composure and he tells them stories. And he even writes these really moving letters to Erwin Schutz, his friend, his Swiss friend, about how he doesn't really even prepare for confirmation, that he comes in and he asks the boys stories about their lives. And then he says, of course I know the Bible real well. So then I weave together the biblical text and their stories and stories from my life. So there's this way that he, in this deep way, kind of, gives the biblical text to them as the confession of this person. And he does that by holding his composure. And so, one of the ways that I talk about this with youth workers is that there's a kind of pedagogical way of doing ministry here, is how do we hold composure with young people that communicates that we're actually there for their personhood and not just there to get the lesson done or something. And then, how do our stories actually mediate this personal and this personhood that's so central to Bonhoeffer? For Bonhoeffer, Jesus Christ, I guess this goes back to the Christopraxis conversation, but for Bonhoeffer, as discipleship says, like Jesus Christ comes to us, the call of discipleship and grace comes to us not as a program, not as a principle, not as a doctrine, but it comes as only one thing, the person of Jesus Christ who calls us to come and follow. So Bonhoeffer's always contrasting person with idea. And so youth ministry, which I think has happened in North America, has often been the wing of the church that's supposed to promote the idea of Christianity to the next generation. I think what Bonhoeffer would push us to is, how does youth ministry become a place that ignites the imagination of young people in the church as a whole to seek for and participate in the person of Jesus Christ? And how is youth ministry about sharing in the person of Jesus Christ through sharing in the person of one another? And I think that's what Bonhoeffer does with telling these stories. Share in my person, let me share in yours, as we witness to and wrestle with the biblical text.
Yeah, and the other thing I thought kind of unique about Bonhoeffer, especially in today's context, is his kind of insistence that the youth take responsibility for their role in the church, and that the adults in the church listen and heed the place of youth in the church's proper body, and not like in its little basement.
Yeah, totally. I mean, one of the great finds, and people had known about this, but it's so buried in the Fortress Bonhoeffer Works things, like those big blue volumes. But there's actually at the end of in one of the appendices, and you have to know you're a famous theologian if you've read those. I'm looking at them right now. If you've read those Fortress volumes, because like everything Bonhoeffer has ever written, like past volume, like volume 9 or something is like the prison letters, or 8. But everything past there, and there's like 16 volumes. Is like everything he's ever written. So it's like letters to his mom that say, these are published. Like, Mom, can you please send the laundry to Munich? I'll be at so-and-so monastery. Like, you'd have to be a pretty famous theologian that every email you've ever written has been published in some book. But that's,
not.
Yeah, that would be terrible.
Is there a self-destruct thing on your email? Like,
you need it, man. Yeah, every tweet you've ever sent will someday be in some volume book as people are reading it, writing dissertations about it. But anyhow, in one of these volumes, long story longer, in one of these volumes, there's the 8 Theses on Youth Work. It's like buried in the back of it. So these 8 Theses on Youth Work, and we have no idea when it was written. It's sometime in the late 1930s. But the first one is exactly what you were saying earlier, where Bonhoeffer says the problem with the church is the church has been more enamored with the youthful spirit than with the Holy Spirit. And then he basically goes on to talk about how the church really wants young people in the congregation because we want our institutions to feel vital, and youthfulness gives us a sense of being a vital, important institution, but it hasn't led us to actually share in the concrete humanity of young people, and that the young people need to be drawn to the life of the congregation. And he says these really powerful things about how there can be no separate space, and there can be no such thing as Christian youth, that there has to be this way of driving young people to the center of the life of the community. It's just quite different than North American youth ministry.
Well, yeah, and one of the things that comes out is, like, at least for me, like having been a youth minister for a while and reading, you think, that's nice, Dietrich. You have not been to my church. Yeah. If you met the adults, they would have no interest in this.
Right.
In fact, we have a hard enough time getting them to care about the other adults near them, let alone someone that hasn't already decided that this church, this service, everything is exactly how we want it. We don't want anyone to change, nothing to do different. And if we had to be interrupted in our lives for having to listen and care to teenagers, or expected to actually be open with them about ours, we'd have to go somewhere else.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's the challenge, I guess, that connects Christopraxis and Bonhoeffer as a youth worker, is this sense of how do we create spaces for adults in the congregation, and kids, I guess, but really adults to take the initiative to articulate their experiences of the presence and absence of God in their life. And we keep on looking in our churches for some kind of flashy youth ministry program, but I think what Bonhoeffer would actually push us to is how do we actually testify to the presence and absence of God in our lives and wrestle with those realities. And can we do that with young people? And I think you're exactly right. People aren't too keen on doing that right now. I mean, they want to stay away from that, but I don't know if we have a future unless, I think we do have a future, but I think that our call is actually to participate in doing that.
Well, there you go. So, what's next for Andy Root? You're going to have 3 books come out this year, which are?
No, I don't know about that. Actually, this is, we just got news today that we received our Templeton grant. So,
awesome.
Yeah, so that will be exciting. And it's one of those moments where you get word that you got this 3-year, for us, it's a very significant dollar amount grant, and you first think, this is the greatest news ever. And then about 30 seconds later, you think, oh my gosh, this means a lot of work. So it's both the dread and the absolute excitement of that.
Well, say a little bit about it, because I mean, I know about it, but not everyone does.
Yeah, so Tripp, you helped us out when we did the planning grant. It was called Science for Youth Ministry, and now it will be called Science for Youth Ministry: The Plausibility of Transcendence, which sounds like it's like part 2 of a Star Wars movie or something. The grant will be really
The Wrath of Kant. Oh, there you go.
There we go. Yes, that will be the next one. But yeah, the idea of the grant is to try to help resource. Well, our hunch is that if we can find a way to front the faith and science conversation in youth ministries, that will open up big conversations like we had earlier in this podcast about the plausibility of transcendence, about actually, is it plausible to believe that there's a God who is transcendent, who actually encounters our lives? Is the person of Jesus Christ, is that a plausible construct to think in? And so we think if we just have a conversation about science, unless you're in a church like you were in, Tripp, and are a talented youth worker like you were, it's pretty hard for people to have that conversation. But if we can help them resource that conversation a little bit, it might open up what we think is a really significant one about the plausibility of finding transcendence in the immanent frame, really.
Yeah, definitely.
That's where we're going with it.
Oh, I'm excited about it. All I know is that plenty of people do ask about it, and because I've had tons of friends that are youth ministers that either took, I record me doing it and then let them use it, or they'll borrow stuff I did or have me come do it. So, and what's amazing is how if you just do science well, then the inherited kind of 1960s and 70s mechanistic determinism, the kind of myth of scientism as this destroying of all openness and existence just goes away. And all you really have to do is play what was 2000 to 2010's Nobel Prizes in science. And I'll use them and go through and just well, I guess that, and it's a lot of fun. And then the moment you give young adults the possibility of not being having their eyes rolled at them to share their experience, like when you've opened it up and said, I know you give a weird, obnoxious amount of authority to, but let me show you that this is actually possible. The moment you kind of open it up scientifically, then these stories, like the ones that are in Christopraxis, just start coming out.
Right.
And what's amazing is I did it once at a confirmation retreat, and everyone was after third day or whatnot, people are talking about the experiences of God that move them and drive them, and then someone sits there telling this experience. Their friend sitting next to them realizes it's a story about their friendship, and this conversation they had when both of them had their parents were both going through divorce at the same time, and one called the other. And the other needed to get called, and the other one had to have someone hear them. And they were both going to share the same phone call when Christ picked up.
Wow.
And neither one has ever told the other one how they were so depressed and lonely and needed someone to care. and the other one was that for them.
Yeah.
And after, like talking about the interconnectivity of the world and all these kinds of things, then they felt okay to say it. And like in that moment, they realized that they had been ministering to each other, and they would have never told each other or never even acknowledged it very deeply until the science stuff was settled enough way that there could be a real God that does real things.
Right, and that's exactly what I mean by Christopraxis right there.
Yeah.
Like that is Christopraxis, yeah. So we hope that conversation will, you can see how these things are, at least in my mind, kind of connected, that if we can kind of front that conversation, then we can kind of oppose, which I think Charles Taylor is really right about, that the kind of knee-jerk reaction is that's the scientific reductionism is a more mature position to be in. Like if you're someone who's not very mature and you need a God, that's fine. But if you're mature, then you can kind of outgrow concepts of God. And so we actually want to kind of problematize that and wrestle with that. And we think it will open up to these moments of something like Christopraxis, of encountering the presence of God that comes to us and this kind of possibility out of nothingness.
Yeah, definitely. Well, thank you tons for joining the podcast again and talking, and then continuing to talk about both books and upcoming projects and all that kind of stuff.
Thanks, Trip, man. It's a pleasure.